Another popular animal product in South Africa is poultry meat. And now that $20 billion market is at the center of a trade disagreement with the U.S. The U.S. is warning South Africa that it could lose a lucrative trade deal if it doesn't open up that market.
Welcome back. The dispute between...
When we were facing apartheid, when we were facing oppression, he was not here. He did not fight side by side with us. And we were able, on our own, yes, with support of progressive forces in the world, to resolve the apartheid question. As far as I recall, Donald Trump was not around the negotiating table when we negotiated the end of apartheid. So stick around there in the White House. We will do our business here, and we will find solutions for our problem. So stay out of our issues, and we will not get involved in your issues in America.
The shock started quietly, just a few lines released in an official statement from Pretoria. No drama, no shouting, no threats, just a simple announcement that South Africa was making a decision that would change the direction of its entire trade policy. But within hours, within minutes even, the echo of that announcement slammed in too. Washington, like a wave no one saw coming, South Africa had closed the door. Not halfway, not temporarily, completely. At first, the U.S. didn't take it seriously. They thought it was routine politics, another negotiation tactic, another moment of diplomatic friction that would blow over in 24 hours. But this was no tactic. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't something America could smooth over with a phone call or a carefully worded press release. It was real, it was firm, and it was final. South Africa wasn't bluffing. South Africa wasn't waiting. South Africa wasn't asking permission. For the first time in a very long time, South Africa said no to the United States and meant it. Inside Washington, the energy shifted instantly. Officials who had dismissed the breaking news found themselves refreshing briefings, calling analysts, demanding explanations. They needed to know how this happened, why this happened, what it meant, and most importantly what South Africa wanted. But South Africa didn't want anything. That's what made this so shocking. This wasn't a negotiation for better terms. It wasn't an attempt at leverage. It wasn't a response to American demands. It was a declaration of sovereignty. A message to both the West and the world that South Africa was no longer playing the old game, no longer accepting the old rules, no longer willing to let foreign markets shape its economy at the expense of its own industries and people. For decades, American imports flooded African markets, cheap, subsidized, mass-produced goods that undercut local producers and dominated entire industries. Everyone knew it, everyone understood the imbalance, but few countries had the courage to challenge it. The risk was too great, the backlash too heavy, the power gap too wide. But now, everything is different. South Africa had finally reached a point where it understood its own leverage, its market size, its influence, its regional leadership, its geopolitical weight. And in one bold move, Pretoria made it clear that it was done being the junior partner in its own economy. The shockwaves spread fast. American corporations that relied on South African markets panicked. Investors scrambled to figure out what this meant for their revenue streams. Export executives demanded emergency meetings. Phone lines between Washington and Pretoria lit up, but the response was the same every time. South Africa is protecting its market. South Africa is prioritizing its producers. South Africa is choosing South Africa, and the world noticed. Across Africa, a wave of applause erupted. Commentators celebrated the decision as a moment of economic courage. Farmers, manufacturers, and industry leaders from Kenya to Ghana to Namibia called it inspiring. It was more than a policy shift. It was a continental declaration that Africa was no longer a dumping ground for foreign surplus. It was a message to the rest of the world: treat Africa fairly or lose access to its markets. Meanwhile, inside South Africa, the energy was electric. Local producers, especially in sectors long dominated by American imports, felt a wave of relief they hadn't experienced in years. Business owners spoke with pride. Farmers said they finally had a chance to compete. Small industries, once suffocated by foreign prices, saw a path to revival. For ordinary South Africans, the decision symbolized something far bigger than trade. It represented the reclaiming of economic identity, a shift toward independence, a statement that local capacity mattered more than foreign convenience. But while Africa celebrated, America grappled with a painful reality. This wasn't just about the loss of a market. This wasn't just about money. This was about influence, global influence. Washington wasn't losing South Africa's business. It was losing South Africa's alignment, and when South Africa moves, much of the continent watches closely, and the timing. Terrible for the US. Because China, Russia, the Middle East, BRICS Plus, and emerging global partners have been strengthening ties with Africa at historic speed. South Africa's refusal reinforced a truth Washington didn't want to accept. Africa is no longer dependent on the US. Africa has choices now. Africa has leverage, Africa has power, and Washington is learning how it feels to be on the outside looking in. Behind closed doors, American analysts warned politicians that this wasn't a one-country issue, it could become a trend. If one African nation could block US imports, others could follow. That fear spread faster than the news itself, because the last thing Washington wanted was a South Africa-led trend of African trade independence. Yet that is exactly what began unfolding. African commentators, leaders, and trade groups praised South Africa's decision as a blueprint. Some floated similar policy proposals. Others argued that Africa must break free from foreign-made dependence once and for all. And slowly, very slowly, Washington realized the true scale of the problem. This wasn't a simple trade rejection. It was a sign, a symbol, a turning point. For generations, Africa was told what to import, how to structure its markets, and what role it should play in the global economy. But South Africa's decision shattered that assumption. Africa wasn't being reactive anymore. Africa was being proactive, strategic, assertive, unapologetic, and America didn't see it coming. Because America never imagined that the countries it once lectured about development, democracy, and economics would one day stand at the negotiating table as equals. Or even stronger, South Africa's decision didn't just block imports. It blocked an old era. It blocked an old hierarchy. It blocked an old way of doing business. And in doing so, South Africa opened the door to a new world, one where Africa chooses its partners, sets its terms, and protects its own industries without fear of consequences from global powers who once dictated everything. This is why Washington is shaken. This is why the news exploded. This is why the world is watching. Because if South Africa can do this confidently, boldly, and without blinking, then what will Africa do next? And more importantly, who will be next? The first shock was the announcement. The second shock was the reaction. Because just hours after South Africa shut the door on US imports, the consequences detonated across global markets like a chain of fireworks, each one louder than the last. In Washington, panic turned into confusion. Confusion turned into frustration. Frustration turned into something the US rarely experiences on the global stage: helplessness. No one expected South Africa to stand so firm. No one predicted a complete shutdown of US goods, and absolutely no one imagined the ripple effect it would unleash. The first wave hit American corporations. Companies that had spent decades dominating African markets suddenly found themselves locked out with no backup plan. CEOs demanded answers. Stock analysts warned of upcoming losses. Investor calls were filled with the same question: how did we underestimate South Africa this badly? Because South Africa wasn't bluffing, it wasn't negotiating, it wasn't looking for compromise. They had already moved on, but while Washington scrambled, Pretoria was calm, almost unbothered. Government officials spoke with clarity. South Africa was restructuring its trade ethics, prioritizing local industries, protecting domestic producers from foreign dominance that had lasted far too long. And that's when the second wave hit. Africa started paying attention. From Ghana to Uganda, from Zambia to Senegal, African governments began reviewing their own import structures. Talk shows buzzed with excitement. Economists called it the beginning of a new era. Business owners called it economic freedom. Citizens called it long overdue. For the first time, African nations were watching a major player challenge the United States and win. Meanwhile, in Europe, officials shifted uneasily. If South Africa could assert itself this boldly, what stopped the rest of Africa from rewriting the rules of global trade? What stopped Africa from turning away from old partners and toward rising global powers? What stopped the entire continent from breaking free of Western influence? But it was the third wave that shook Washington the hardest. Because as South Africa closed the door on US imports, it quietly opened another door, one leading straight toward the east. China? Delighted. Russia? Supportive. BRICS partners? Energized. Suddenly, South Africa wasn't the one begging for access, it was the one being courted. New trade proposals flooded Pretoria: better prices, fairer terms, cleaner contracts. Offers the US never imagined South Africa would receive. Offers the US never wanted South Africa to even consider. But South Africa did more than consider them. They welcomed them, and this terrified Washington. Because South Africa wasn't just shifting trade, it was shifting loyalty, shifting alliances, shifting power, and where South Africa goes, the continent watches closely. Inside the U.S., desperate attempts to contact Pretoria began. Diplomats tried to soften the situation. Senators sent letters. State Department officials asked for dialogue. But every conversation met the same quiet response. South Africa is choosing its economic future, not America's comfort. And just like that, the U.S. realized it had lost something far more valuable than a trade deal. It had lost influence. The fourth wave arrived on the ground in South Africa itself. Local industries exploded with activity. Farmers expanded production. Manufacturers hired workers. Businesses that had been crushed by cheap American imports finally breathed again. It felt like a revival, a rebirth, an economic awakening. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the space they had fought for. This was the chance they had never been given. Now, with American imports blocked, the playing field was finally level. In communities across the country, the mood shifted from shock to pride. People spoke about the decision with a sense of ownership. South Africans saw themselves as defenders of their own economy, protectors of their industries, participants in a historic break from dependency. And that's when the fifth wave hit. Washington realized something devastating. If other African nations followed South Africa's lead, the U.S. could lose access to over 1.4 billion consumers and the world's fastest-growing economic region. It wasn't just about South Africa anymore, it was about the future of American influence across the entire African continent. Washington had hoped South Africa would rethink. They hoped Pretoria would reconsider. They hoped the move was temporary, but Pretoria didn't flinch, not once. Instead, government ministers doubled down. They called the moment a turning point in African economic sovereignty. They encouraged other African countries to evaluate their own import dependencies. And quietly, very quietly, they began scouting new global partners who would treat South Africa as an equal, not a subordinate. The U.S. tried to retaliate. Subtle diplomatic pressure, threats of trade reviews, warnings about consequences, but none of it worked. South Africa no longer feared the consequences of saying no because this was bigger than one trade dispute. This was the breaking of a pattern. This was the end of economic submission. This was the start of a new African attitude. And in the background, Africa's biggest players, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, Algeria, began watching very closely. If South Africa could stand up to the United States and survive, why couldn't they? For the first time, the fear shifted. Africa was no longer afraid of the U.S. The U.S. was afraid of Africa's example. And Washington understood the truth no one wanted to admit. If South Africa can slam the door on America once, they can do it again, and others might follow. This is no longer a trade story. This is a global power story. The story of what happens when Africa stops asking for permission and starts acting with power. As the dust settles, one truth has become impossible to ignore. South Africa didn't just shut the door on U.S. imports. It opened a new chapter in global power. This wasn't a small policy change. This wasn't a trade disagreement. This was a signal to the world, a signal that Africa is no longer accepting the old rules of global economics. And now, every major power is watching, nervous, curious, worried. Because if South Africa can stand up to the United States and walk away stronger, what happens when the rest of Africa does the same? What happens when 54 nations think together, trade together, negotiate together? What happens when Africa realizes that the world needs it, far more than it needs the world? That is the question shaking Washington. That is the fear unsettling Europe. And that is the possibility inspiring millions across the continent. So as this story unfolds day by day, deal by deal, decision by decision, one thing is clear. The age of Africa asking for permission is over. The age of Africa commanding respect has begun, and trust me, the world has no idea what comes next. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.